Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Father Emmanuel Lemelson. He is an Orthodox priest, and in this conversation we talk about Orthodoxy, its core theology, its principles, and how it is distinct from other forms or lineages of Christianity. Deep fellow. He's also married and stuff, so he is plugged into the world in a different way than our Catholic priests, at least officially, and actually just in the pattern of his life. You can find links to his work down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Father Emmanuel Lemelson.
Benjamin, would you be opposed to us beginning with a prayer before we get started?
No, I was just doing that myself.
Oh, wonderful.
You want to lead?
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I mean, you're welcome to lead the prayer if you like, either way.
No, I want to check your vibe. Or follow your lead, rather.
Let's follow Christ's lead, both of us. Okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, our help and refuge, fountain of wisdom and tower of strength, who knows that we can do nothing without thy guidance and help. Assist us, we pray thee, and direct us to divine wisdom and power, that we may accomplish this task, and whatever we may undertake to do faithfully and diligently, according to thy will, so that it may be profitable to ourselves and to others, and to the glory of thy holy name. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, now and forever, and to the age of ages. Amen.
Amen.
So, how's the audio quality? Is it okay for you, Benjamin?
Yeah, it's good.
All right.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Good.
Great quality. I like your icon behind you of the Theotokos.
It's from Greece, actually. My wife went last year and brought me a couple of things back.
What was her impression of Greece?
There was a conference around the evidence for the benefit of gender medicine, quote unquote, in minors, and she's facilitating that. As you might suppose, there's very little evidence that it's beneficial.
That would have been my guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you, what is the Orthodox relationship to like places in the world? Is there like holy sites? Are they all over? Is there special places? And
yeah, of course.
Do you go, do you go on pilgrimages yourself?
I've been. I think most Orthodox would point to Mount Athos as one of the holiest places. And I've been there when I was younger. I must have been maybe 19 or 20 when I stayed at Mount Athos. But, I think, Benjamin, that the holy places are those where people have prayed fervently from their heart. But in some places, churches, chapels, cathedrals, wherever those prayers have been there for a long time, one might imagine that those places become sanctified.
When did you discover the power of prayer? No, I've never been to Athos. That's got to be in Greek. Sounds like a Greek word.
Yeah, so those three fingers in the peninsula of Greece. One of those fingers is it's technically an autonomous republic, and there's I want to say 26 or 27 monasteries, I believe. Don't quote me on it. Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. There's Bulgarian communities there. It's quite remarkable if you Google it. It's extraordinary, Mount Athos. So, but I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please, Benjamin, you were asking a question.
Yeah. When did you discover the power of prayer or the reality of prayer?
Well, I was baptized as an Orthodox Christian, Benjamin, but we did not attend church frequently when I was young, very infrequently, in fact. And I had, I think, always a notion of God. And I recall speaking to him at a very young age. I didn't know it was prayer or that you would call it prayer. But I think that was all reassessed. Maybe when I was 17 or 18, I had a very strong calling to serve God as a priest. And that calling was overwhelming. And then that led to the beginning of trying to cultivate a life of prayer. And then over the years, I think it did grow.
One would hope so, that one develops what they practice.
Well, when you begin your day with prayer, I always think, Benjamin, that the day just goes better, honestly. I feel like when we begin the day by orienting our life to God, and certainly when we conclude our day the same way, things just get better. I mean, anxiety, stress, fears, they just fade into the background. And I think we make better decisions.
There's a Blake line about cleansing the doors of perception. So insofar as prayer quiets one, extends one's awareness of the world, that should lead to better perspective and therefore better decisions.
Yeah, in the Orthodox tradition, I'm sure you know, Benjamin, we have this tradition of the hesychasts, which comes from the Greek word for ησυχία, which means silence or quiet. So, and there's this beautiful saying that, in the silence or in the quiet, we find the truth. And if you look at our modern world, it's drowned out. The silence is drowned out by all the talking. We live in a world that's hyper inundated with podcasts, for example. Thank God there's good ones like yours. But
Thank you.
Generally there's so much talking, there's so much chatter that we scarcely have a moment for peace and quiet. That is to say, we scarcely have a moment to find the truth. If it's true that in the silence we find the truth. And Benjamin, remind me, I don't think you're Orthodox. Your background, your faith background? I believe your daughter's Orthodox though, right?
Yes. Stepdaughter. She just got baptized on Easter, along with her baby boy. And I guess I grew up evangelical. My father became a pastor over the course of my childhood. And so a lot of exposure to Pentecostal expressions of worship. And so very young, I knew God was and is and will be, and that his power extends into us in a very intimate way through a quality that is best represented by the word love.
Sure. Are you still practicing evangelical?
No. My practice is it's a non-dogmatic spiritual practice called subud. It's precedes any sort of formal service, but it allows me, or it has allowed me over the 20 years that I've been practicing it, to resonate deeper with a variety of faiths, but knowing for myself that I am a Christian, like the parameters of my higher self are best expressed through Christianity. And so especially the older forms of Christianity hit me and bring me closer to the state of worship than almost anything other than my practice.
When you say older forms, you mean like Orthodoxy?
Yeah, Catholicism, Orthodoxy. I've traveled to Europe. Whenever I travel to Europe, I make sure to spend as much time as possible praying in cathedrals and places of worship. Because as you say, they're just inundated or inscribed with worship in those places. And so the only places that I've been in Europe of that sort have been Catholic. Okay. So I haven't been to any ancient Orthodox or older Orthodox places. But
I'm guessing
when I visited my daughter's church, I could feel, even though it's kind of a new church over on the peninsula in Washington State, there was definitely, it was a good place. It was a sincere sight. It was very evident to me.
Yeah, the Northwest is, it's full of the beauty of God's creation with the Olympics and the Cascade Mountain Ranges and Site, Mount Rainier.
Yeah.
Mountains are always associated with the divine.
Yeah, they're kind of terrifying in a way. I keep on looking at them, and they're always shockingly, awesome in like kind of this terrifying, awe-inspiring way.
If you don't mind me asking, how did your stepdaughter come to Orthodoxy? I mean, maybe I'm asking too much, but I'm just curious.
I don't know. I think she was looking for a church because she felt the desire to live and to worship, and that's what she found. And she found a good community, and then she entered through the process of, I believe it's called catechumen or
Catechism.
something.
Yeah.
Catechism, yeah.
Hmm.
So that's all I know.
She became a catechumen. She was in catechism.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Is it a Russian community or a Greek community? I should know that. I heard of some mission on the peninsula in Washington. I don't recall now if it was led by Russian clergy or Greek clergy.
I don't know. I did spend a little bit of time talking with the father, perhaps the priest. Sorry, I grew up evangelical, so we just exchanged minister and reverend and pastor and preacher all together. So, but we know we don't have priests. So I know you
That's
guys
okay, Benjamin.
do.
People probably call me a lot worse when I'm not around, so don't worry about it.
Yeah. I don't know if it's Greek or Russian. Which strain is yours?
Well, all the Orthodox churches are one communion,
Yeah.
but typically run along ethnic lines: Bulgarians, Romanians, Russians, Ukrainians, Greeks. I'm Greek American myself. So my mother's from the island of Crete, and then I lived in Greece for a number of years. So, but I'm also half American.
Half American? What does
Yeah,
that mean?
I guess whatever. My dad was very American.
Okay.
It
Yeah.
was like as American as you could get. But
Yeah.
I guess I feel like I could see both perspectives, very different perspectives. As a kid, you grown up in Greece in like in the early 80s. It was really quite an experience, Benjamin. Back then there was like two TV channels and they were black and white. And then there were no fast food chains. So you know what I remember? I remember being a kid in Greece, like 6, 7, 8 years old. I'm like, I want a cheeseburger, like more than anything else. Like a McDonald's cheese, I want a Happy Meal for crying out. Like that's the things an 8-year-old misses when they're living in a foreign country. And there's like now it's KFC everywhere, and it totally just kind of ruins it. But instead you end up getting these other things, and you're exposed to all these foods, these strong foods, and you're a kid. And back then, it was such an undeveloped country, but it was such a beautiful country. It was very safe, one of the safest countries in Europe. So it was this really incredible childhood to have. We could go out at night and walk the streets till 11 p.m. and go see movies in open air movie theaters. And I remember when we came back to America, I remember my mom sitting down with my brother and I and saying, look, when we go back to America, you can't just get in cars with strangers. You can't just talk to strangers. I'm like, really? Why? Why is that? I had lost the sense of the dangers of America, living in talk about peaceful, it's a very peaceful country. So it left quite a mark.
Greece
Yeah.
is such an important place, but modern Greece is not as significant as ancient Greece. How does that affect the Grecian self-awareness or self-character, you think?
Well, don't tell that to the Greeks, what you just said.
Well, I mean, I'm an American, so comparatively, I'm in a
They
safe
might they
position to
might
say
block
that.
you at customs when you go there or something. Say, oh, stop! That's Ben Boyce. We can't let him in the country. He said modern Greece is under support. I think for the Greeks, they don't see an ancient and modern Greece, Ben. If you go to Greece, you'll see very quickly that it's a life lived in retrospect. And there's some credit to be said for that because there's an extraordinary history, and you notice it right away when you're there. You go to the Parthenon and you see these the museum just at the base of the Parthenon, or you drive south and you see the Temple of Sunyon. And it's everywhere, the rich history. You can't escape it. And so this idea of being connected with our past, with our history, where we come from, Western civilization, is really good. It's a virtue. But there's risks. You're right, Benjamin, that there's this risk that we live in the past instead of living in the future. I think that's probably always a risk that Greeks face. Is on the one hand, being very proud, in an innocent sense of the word of proud, of their past and their heritage and so forth, and on the same time, not living enough in the present or the future.
Well, I mean, that's the opposite of what is affecting young people right now, and I think why there's an uptick or upsurge of young people coming to Orthodoxy, perhaps Catholicism, right now is because we don't have, or they lack a past so severely that the future and the present are hollow.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've observed that quite a lot. I didn't just live in Greece. I've lived in a lot of different countries. And as an American, looking back, I would often observe that Americans had a need to associate with some cultural group. You even see it within Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is really super interesting in America because you have this cultural milieu which is mixed with different faiths and peoples and ethnic groups and so forth. And then within Orthodoxy, you see these churches have a historical association with a country, like take ROCOR or OCA, both associated with the Russian Orthodox Church. But in the case of the Orthodox Church in America, is it an indigenous American church? And if so, what does that mean? Yet their clergy don the vestments and so forth, the regalia of the Russian Orthodox Church. So this idea that we can be separated from culture, or the influence of culture and the authority of tradition, yeah, it's questionable, as Americans have often sought to do, I think, because we're very individualistic in our society. And we don't like the idea that maybe a community comes first, or immediate family, or so forth, and that the individual will come last. It's a very, very individualistic society, and yet we seek that. We seek that association with the past, with a culture. And that's been my observation, at least. I'm not sure about you, what you've seen, but even in the case of the evangelicals, as you pointed out, of course, it's a Greek word, as you know. And then you mentioned the Pentecostals, also a Greek word. So you can't escape the influence of the Greek language and the Greek history. And, faith, it emerges in a culture, it emerges in a language. And you mentioned the Catholic Church, for example, also a Greek word, katholikos. Evangelismos is the Greek. Pentecosti is the Greek. So these words have meaning. And as much as the Catholic Church would like to believe that it's a Latin world, for example, the reality is they actually just Latinize mostly Greek words. Like you mentioned katechesis, or catechism. It's a Greek word. Katechoumeni, the ones who are learning about the faith. If you have even a passing interest in etymology, you start to say, well, wait, the language is tied to the culture. When you learn the language and you get inside the mind of the author, who might be writing, like, say, the Gospel, the New Testament Greek, you start to see inside the mind of the person and their culture and their language and so forth, and how it's being influenced. So, in terms of us as Americans, we're a relatively new country. We're not very old by comparison. And even the English language, as wonderful as it is and can be, in my opinion, lacks the depth of thought of, for example, New Testament Greek or even modern Greek. So we as the faithful, you or I, or anyone interested in the Christian tradition and following Christ, it's good to recognize that the Christian church emerged in this Byzantine world, this Mediterranean region, where Greek was the language. It's like English today, where English is used almost universally, but at that time, it was Greek. So when you learn the Greek and you hear these words, you get inside the mind of the people of that time. Not unlike you might read, for example, C.S. Lewis, and you say, well, I kind of get a sense of what the Oxford Dawn environment was in the 1940s and 1950s through Lewis's magnificent use of English, which of course is predicated on reading ancient Greek poetry and Latin and so forth. So, if you look at the Slavic churches, for example, the Russian Orthodox churches in America are growing in leaps and bounds. God bless them. But that's a church that is just 1,000 years old, if we can say just.
Well, if anybody can, it would be you guys. So,
But the Greeks would say, well, it's really, we've got 2,000 years of history. And if you look at the Cyrillic alphabet, of course, it's really just the Greek alphabet modified.
Mm-hmm. So. I have a big question that you're teasing out of my mind. So what happened in brief was that the Hebrew scriptures were refracted via Christ through Greek onto the West. Right? The Greek was a lens through the language by which the gospel, which is based on a Hebraic tradition, through Christ was projected onto the West. It's what formed the West. Do
you mean Aramaic tradition? Because the spoken tradition was Aramaic, no?
Well, I knew I was going to make that mistake. I did write down, I did write down Aramaic, but it is the Hebrew tradition that was then Aramicized, right? So how does the Greek influence If this is
Well,
if this is the watershed.
All right, go ahead. Yeah, please, Benjamin.
Yeah, if this is the fountainhead of the West, then how did Greek influence what was brought through Greek into the West via Christianity, via Christ?
Well, in the Old Testament, we have the Old Testament prophets, right? This is the Hebrew tradition you're talking about, I assume, right? The Old Testament. And God's revelation is working through the Jewish people. There's no question about that. And his prophets. The revelation of himself. And his love for his creation. You used the word love earlier to describe God. I think that's exactly right. In Greek, it's agape, right? But this emerges in his greatest manifestation, beyond the prophets, is the emergence of Christ, his son, O Christos, the anointed one. Christos comes from Christos, the anointed one. His only begotten son, who became man. And he emerges in this point of time. It's really a Greek world. Greek is being used throughout the Roman Empire for trade and so forth. And prior to that time, we have the emergence of the Greek philosophers, right? So you've got these sort of this intellectual framework which is being laid down. And in Athens, what do they have? They have the statue to the unknown God. So they're searching, but the Hebrew people, who later become the Jews, they know who God is, but his actions to save them from themselves, so to speak, are not working. And ultimately his love, as you point out so accurately, is to give his only begotten son to save them from their sins. So you have the convergence, they talk about a cultural milieu, where this convergence of the Greek philosophers, which are asking the questions, the key questions for a secular world. You have the revelation of the Jewish prophets, the Hebrew prophets, and then you have the person of Christ emerging in that world. And then the disciples who, shortly after Christ's death and resurrection, become apostles, go out into what? The Greek world. They're going into Asia Minor, Cappadocia, Illyria, Greece, eventually to Rome. And they're interacting in a world that knows the Greek philosophers, but they don't know anything really about the revelation of the Jews, much less the person of Christ. And they're using what? They're using Greek philosophy. They're learned men. For example, we just commemorated the feast day of St. Justin Martyr. He was a philosopher. So the Greek philosophy, and of course in Greek is another Greek word, philosophia, the love of wisdom. You know, in the ecclesiastical sense, we use sophia, wisdom, to refer to God. So a love of wisdom is really a love of God. This framework, which the Greeks couldn't get to, Plato and Aristotle and so forth, couldn't get to the answers, but they had the questions. The Jews had answers, but were botching it, let's say. And then comes the person of Christ. And some will see, they'll have eyes to see and ears to hear, and others won't. Mm-hmm. But that is the cultural milieu in which the Hebrew, as you're saying, ultimately becomes the New Testament, keni diatheke in Greek, which is the new covenant, becomes the evangelismos, the good news. Evangelia means good news. Anytime you see like an EU in Greek, it means good. Like eugenics, which is a terrible word, or you could say, euthanasia. Again, another terrible word. They're contradictory, but evangelismos just means good news.
Mm-hmm. Can I? There's two questions that I have from that. Two interesting points of tension. You brought up the key questions of the secular world, and you brought up that the people of the prophets of Israel were botching it. So something was revealed to Israel as a people, and they botched it, or they were botching it somehow. And were they botching it because they weren't translating it into something that could, reflect positively onto the world or help the world beyond themselves? Or were they botching it because of human nature, or what?
Well, to be sure, it's human nature. I don't think that the Israelites, the Jewish people, have a monopoly on hardening their heart to God. We're all capable of that. But what they had was the revelation that others didn't. So they had this magnificent revelation of God. And if you look at the story of the Old Testament, from the Pentateuch on, right, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, you've got this initial disobedience. And Adam and Eve will ultimately turn their back on God because they want to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. knowledge being the operative word in my opinion, gnosis in Greek. And they ultimately think they'll be like God, and they're tempted by the one who wants to be God because he lacks all humility. The one thing the devil or the tempter cannot ever have is humility. So they lose paradise, right? They lose the garden. They have everything they need. And sin enters the world through this disobedience. They become aware of the fact that they're naked. They're ashamed. And then we see from that point on, things get essentially worse. Then we have the story of Cain and Abel, this terrible tragedy, murder, patricide enters the world. And it's just getting worse and worse. And then we have, of course, the flood. God's taking action, essentially, to try to bring his beloved creation back to himself. And it's not working. And eventually that culminates, we go through the prophets and the law, right? We've got Moses, and he reveals the law to his people. And when Moses goes up to receive the Ten Commandments, he asks God, what should I tell the people is your name? And God responds, I am, right? So to this day, if you look at the halo around Christ's head, like in that icon behind you, you see in Greek, oon in Greek. It means I am. Christ in the icon, it's written, he is God. So the Jewish people, they, of course, the law is incredibly good for them, and all of Western law is predicated on the Ten Commandments. But the law is really not enough, because as it's been said in the Holy Scriptures, the law without faith is a curse. So even after receiving the law, how they should live, and despite this direct revelation of God in the prophets, the chief prophet, of course, was Moses. We hear the Pharisees saying in the New Testament all the time that we have Moses. We don't need this Christ figure, this Jesus of Nazareth. He's a charlatan. And this is closing their eyes. But the law is not enough, Benjamin. It's not enough to turn our hearts back to God. And in my opinion, nothing could define that love of God that you spoke of more clearly than self-sacrifice. So we see the person of Christ giving his life for those he loves, for all of humanity. And he does it publicly. He doesn't ask for help. He doesn't try to escape his fate. He knows this is the will of the Father. And he knows that his blood, his body and his blood, will have this salvific effect through faith. And to me, I could not think of a more beautiful theology. I couldn't think of a greater answer to the problem of humanity, the problem of our disobedience, the problem of our sinfulness, which started at the beginning of creation. Benjamin, if you were to look at all the world's religions, they would all have one thing in common. The world's major religions, let's say Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, even philosophical systems, like you find in East Asia, this idea that at one point creation was perfect. In the Jewish/Christian tradition, that becomes the Garden of Eden. And that perfection was lost. And we're trying to find our way back. That's a common thread throughout world religions. Christianity, however, in my opinion, is head and shoulders above the rest. It's not even in the same league, actually, not in the same universe, in terms of how it describes the actions of an all-loving, creative God to try to bring his beloved, his creation, back to himself.
That makes me think, because the other part of my question was about the questions of the secular world, and if you try to bring in the framework of obedience and disobedience and sin, I feel like that is what is lacking in the secular world. So how is that framework an answer to these secular questions, or what are these secular questions that you brought up that the Greeks were asking?
Well, yeah, so in Greek, the word for obedience is ipakoi. So you're right, though, Benjamin, in our current modern, hyper-secular, hyper-individualistic world, those are like curse words. Obedience? Like, are you kidding me?
We have bigger curse words for those who speak in terms of obedience, such as fascist or nationalist or authoritarian or totalitarian. We have very strong negative words for people who speak in terms of community and obedience to a higher authority than themselves.
Well, you raise a really good point, Benjamin. And in my opinion, there's two types of obedience. There's obedience through fear. When you speak of fascism and so forth, I know a lot about that subject, because I've thought a lot about it. And then there's obedience through love. One is compelled, and one is a free, with emphasis on the word free, act of the soul and of the heart. Obedience from love is very different than obedience from fear. Obedience from fear will bastardize obedience. And it's a cheap alternative. I mean cheap to what obedience should be. You can see it in any abuse of any authority or power structure. When someone doesn't really know how to lead, in other words, they don't know how to be Christ-like, because to lead in a Christ-like way means to be self-sacrificial. They'll substitute obedience out of love with obedience out of fear. And that's where you get these autocratic rulers like I think you're thinking of in these political systems, which do so much harm. And I would say, secondly, you know the difference between a cult and religion proper, Benjamin? Is that a cult looks at a charismatic leader and its attention is directed to that person. Whereas religion proper, certainly, let's use the example of Orthodox Christianity. It is the community of the sinful coming together before their transcendent God. Community, in that sense, unlocks the human spirit. It unlocks true freedom. Obedience in that context is actually the only true freedom there is. Any other form of freedom is a freedom from, not a freedom for. And there's quite an important distinction there. It's a dichotomy. The two are mutually exclusive. But when you have a community that comes together and worships a charismatic leader, it usually ends very, very poorly. I will say it ends very poorly every time. And it misleads the person because we as humans, we're wired for religion. We'll make religion out of anything. It's been going on for thousands of years, certainly in the pre-Christian era.
We'll even make a religion out of secularism.
Completely. Any political, you name it, any political system, any bad proclivity we might have, it could be gambling, it could be anything, we'll make a religion out of it. But there's really only one thing that we can worship that will not harm us, and that is worshiping the living God, and to know the living God. And the teachings of the church and her wisdom guides us to that path of communion with our Creator, with our God. That's why the church is so important. You mentioned dogma earlier. By the way, also a Greek word. So the dogmatic teachings of the church lead us on that path, the straight and narrow path. You know, there's a great book by C.S. Lewis called The Pilgrim's Regress, which is a play on a book, The Pilgrim's Progress. And I'm not sure if you're a fan of C.S. Lewis or not, but Lewis does such a magnificent job of describing getting on sort of the high and narrow path towards this communion with God and all the different ways we can get off the road. And once you're off the road and you're off on some ideological tangent or something, it's not enough to simply turn to get back. You've got to go back to where you veered off the road and get on the right road. And that's where, again, the magnificent teachings of the church and her wisdom through holy tradition, through thousands of years, leads us into that path, and in my opinion, in no greater capacity than the Orthodox Church, which is maintaining the fullness of the teachings of the Church.
Why is, of all the things that could be instrumental towards, there's probably a fancy Greek word for correctly reassessing one's relationship to God, getting back on the path. Why is sacrifice, of all the things, why is sacrifice?
Why sacrifice?
Yeah. Why is sacrifice the pivotal thing that answers these questions?
Yeah. Well, the word you're looking for is metania, first of all, which in Greek means a change of mind. So meta just means after, like Meta, the company owns Facebook, Greek word. And noia is mind. So metanoia, metania, it's a change of mind. Sacrifice, Benjamin, is the greatest form of love. What does a mother do when she gets pregnant? She sacrifices herself for her child, right? The mother's instinct is instant, right? The mother's love is great. What does the father do in the family? He goes to work. Is it because he loves his job? Probably not in most cases. He works long, hard days. He comes home, he's worn out. He's not doing it for himself. He's doing it so his children will have a better future, so his wife can be with the children. Even a friend, you see these stories, these anecdotal stories from wartime, the band of brothers, or whatever, the soldier jumps in front of his friend and takes the bullet for his friend, or the police officer. That's not love. I don't know what is. You got to explain it to me if that's not love. Love in its greatest manifestation is self-sacrifice. It's the opposite of the ego. In Greek, the word ego is ego, I. It's the opposite of narcissism, right? Again, from Greek mythology, Narcissus, he looked in the water at his own image, and he fell in love with his own image until he fell in the water, and so forth. So our modern society falls prey to these temptations. We as humans fall prey, perhaps throughout time. Maybe it's really been ratcheted up now in our modern society because of social media and devices and so forth. But it's the antithesis of that that's love. It's the ability to see the other before we see ourselves, and for the other to be more important than ourselves. As simple as it sounds, I think that is really what we see ultimately par excellence in the person of Christ. A man who lived without sin. He did no harm. He healed the blind. He healed the lame and the paralyzed, and paid a huge price.
I'm trying to express. I don't think I'll be able to express the point of view that I'm reaching for, but God is infinite, and while we can describe him through qualities or the lack of qualities, his infinitude is so great that any aspect of him is essentially arbitrary. So sacrifice can conceivably be just an arbitrary manifestation of God, but once you put God into man, it seems like that's when sacrifice becomes essential to the faith, or essential as a quality of God, or as a quality of what God wants us to learn about God through the experience of being a human being. Do you see? Does that add up?
I think I understand what you're saying. I would just say that we would say that we cannot attribute attributes to God the Father. We can only say what he's not. So the term for that form of theology is apophatic theology, in Greek apophasis. So we can describe what God is not. There's no greatness to infinity, because infinity is simply outside of our conception of greatness.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Man is finite, right?
Yeah.
And God is infinite. Man is within time and space. God is outside time and space. Then by definition, a finite created creature could not conceptualize an infinite, uncreated, right? Principle.
Yeah.
So just to get some of the terms clear.
No, you're shoring up my line of inquiry.
And then in terms of the kenotic theology you referred to, God becoming man, the word was kenotic theology, kenosis in Greek, that God emptied himself out and became man. He was, of course, in the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, we would say he was born of a virgin. He was an immaculate conception. In fact, the word evangelia, I used the word earlier, evangelismos, actually means the annunciation. So the good news was announced to the Virgin. She conceived the Christ child in her womb. In fact, that's why in the Orthodox Church we use the word theotokos, which means the God bearer. Theo is God, right? Like theology. Tokos, the one who bears God.
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to butcher.
Apophatic?
Apophatic theology is only explaining God or communicating about God through negative attributes. But we did both agree that God is closest to being able to be described as something positive through love, or this concept of love. And love, as you said, is best defined as sacrifice.
Well, I said God the Father earlier, just to be clear, when I was talking about apophatic theology.
Okay.
But then we have the Son, the third person of the Holy Trinity, right? Second person, the Holy Trinity, Christ, the Son of God. And so he becomes fully God and fully man. And he sacrifices himself for those he loves.
And in the translation from God to God and man, or God-man, then we can start to understand in our finite capacity positive attributes of God?
Well, we can understand what God has revealed to us, whether that's through the Old Testament prophets or through his only begotten Son. So we can certainly understand what Christ did, what we know from him, from his disciples, from his direct sayings in the Gospels, from his teachings, from his actions, from his miracles. Of course, we can know those things.
And they're best summarized through
the evangelical church. Is it different?
Sorry?
The understanding is the understanding of the evangelical church different than that?
I guess I can't be a rep. I did get my catechism, and I did go to a year of Bible college, and which I didn't didn't fully absorb, even though I was immersed in this language and theology throughout my childhood. I can't represent it faithfully or accurately, so I don't even want to try. But I'm trying to.
Benjamin?
Pardon me?
Are you interested in Orthodoxy? I mean, being aware of its sort of seeming authority. I think that's what you were getting at when you were speaking earlier.
I think it's important for me, and in my position as a father, stepfather, head of a household, to establish a practice of faith and the pattern of worship in the people under my charge, so to speak. And so finding a church for that purpose is necessary, even though I kind of drag my feet because of the whole practice, the habit part of it. So I want to find a place that resonates with my spiritual not understanding, my spiritual sensitivities, I guess. And those that are on offer often have different forms of worship that repulse me. The drums and the lights and the music, and my wife calls it Jesus is my boyfriend kind of music, like this expression of love for God and for Christ that is very boy bandy, very hormonally driven, or at least hormonally activating. And I balk at that, and it actually shoves me away from the worshipful spirit or state. So I would prefer to go towards something that has at heart a quiet to it. I've had experiences at Catholic Mass that have resonated with me, and I have prayed at the Greek Orthodox Church, or at the Orthodox Church that my stepdaughter goes to, and I witnessed the reality of the presence of God there.
Glory be to God. You have other children other than your stepdaughter?
Yeah, there's my wife. I have no children of my own. My wife has 2 older children and then 2 younger children who are my stepsons now, at ages 11 and about to be 14.
Okay, they're your children, to be sure.
Yeah, I'm working on that.
Those are good ages. Those are, especially 11-year-old. They haven't entered adolescence yet.
Yeah.
They're boys, the 2 younger ones.
Yeah.
They say boys, are a little easier to raise when they get, past adolescence, because they're so active when they're young, and the opposite for girls. They're a little easier when they're young.
Yeah.
Into adolescence. And
I know in your faith, there's a possibility of marriage and children. As a priest/father, have you any children of your own, family of your own?
Yeah, I've got 4 children, thanks be to God.
Wow.
Yeah. Not too different in ages from yours. So I've got a 10-year-old, a 14-year-old, I've got a 16-year-old, and a 19-year-old.
Wow.
I'm an old man, Benjamin.
Oh, well, I mean, can't be that old. You're probably younger than me, but why do you think the Catholic Church, I don't want to be negative, I was going to say stymied their priesthood by demanding chastity and blocking family formation through their priesthood? Why did they go in that direction, and what is the benefit of the Orthodox allowance for family in the priesthood?
Well, you may not want to be negative, but I'll do it. It's such a huge mistake what the Catholic Church did. And it wasn't always that way. They had a married clergy for a long time. They even had married bishops. In the Jewish tradition, one of the priorities for the father was to ensure that his son was married, found a wife. Holiness is in the family. The family itself is holy. Look at the Holy Family, Joseph, Mary, Christ child. So why did this ecclesiological aberration come along? Well, first of all, there was always the element in the early church of the ascetics, even prior to the church. I mean, look at John the Baptist. He was not interested in marriage, clearly. And if you look at, there was always this, the cult of the Essenes, for example. There was always this element, this sort of, say, proto-monastic element. And we should not criticize that way of life. They are, in many, many ways, to this day, the monastics preserve the faith. But it was always meant to be the exception, never the rule. When you take a large group of men, in a young age especially, and you parade them into a seminary. I saw a video the other day of all these seminarians coming into the Catholic seminary. I don't know, some social media influencer published it. Oh, this is the future. These guys look like deer caught in front of the headlights to me. There's a lot of ways to wind up single in life, but marriage should be the goal. If you wind up single, fine. You feel strongly, strongly called, like St. Paul, to serve God, like with your whole heart at every moment of your life. Go to a monastery, because you'll have community. We say cenobitic monasteries, The celibate man should not be out in the world, full stop. Now, in Orthodoxy, there are some exceptions to that. We do have churchmen who are celibates and they become hierarchs, they become the bishops, because the married priest can. But in Orthodoxy, we have this amazing ecclesiology where it works out so beautifully well, where there's a really healthy interchange between the bishop and the presbyter, the priest. And presbyter in Greek, as you know, presbyteros, just means elder. And the bishop is episkopos, like we hear about the Episcopal Church, it just means he's the bishop. But this interplay between the bishop, the presbyter, which is almost always married in the Orthodox Church, and his family, and the laity, the body of Christ. It's so beautifully balanced. In the Catholic Church, the reason they insisted on celibacy as a matter of canon law, and as a rule, first was economic, because priests were bequeathing church properties to their children. And the second, more importantly, was to make sure they tied their loyalty to the power structures of Rome. And what a disaster. Just look at our lived experience of the Catholic Church in the last 25 years, 30 years, all these clergy sex abuse scandals. Why were they not being reported properly? When they were reported, why were they brushed under the rug? Even, seemingly smart men like, Cardinal Law in Boston. Look at the lengths he went to cover up clergy sex abuse scandals. Even the current Pope, it appears that he was engaged in similar conduct, according to a lot of reports. And why is it so widespread? Because men don't belong in that lifestyle. When you have all male populations, like you find them where? Historically in the military, in prison, and in the Catholic Church. And things get weird.
That's some shade that you just threw out. Sorry.
Yeah, and I don't know, the Catholic Church in prison, it's getting blurred the lines with all the scandals, but
such a tragedy. Such an absolute tragedy.
You take these young men and it's like, come on. Like, just tell them, go get a girlfriend. Instead, what do? They create a mythology that they're all super pious, that they, you hear the story time and time again. It just drives me nuts. I don't want to say names, but there's some prominent social media influencers. They all use the same, like, meme almost. Like, well, I was this young guy and I had this girlfriend and I loved her, but then I realized I loved Christ more and I had to leave her. That is not God's design. You can be a man, marry her, have children, and lead your wife and your children to God through self-sacrificial love. And honestly, the man who does that right, his way of life would be more holy than the holiest monk, let me tell you. And that is what the world needs. The world does not need another celibate. We don't need them. Actually, the technology and social media is making plenty of celibates right now. You got a whole generation of young men that don't even know how to talk to a girl.
Yeah.
You have a whole generation of girls that think that if they somehow have a loving, intimate relationship with a man and pursue marriage, that they are somehow less. What lies? What lies? They're both being deprived of the most beautiful part of life, which is the possibility for them to have agency in God's creation. Because the aspect of the human person which engages in, we'll use the Catholic word, conjugal act, at that moment, in the Greek we'll say ecstasy, right? Ekstasis, to stand outside of yourself, is to participate in the creation of a new soul, to have agency in it. Not to be the generative source of it. God is the source of all life. But that we should participate in that act. What could be more humbling? Talk about the breaking down of ego boundaries. Mm-hmm. Is ecstasis not the complete elimination of the ego boundary? When it's done right, at that moment of love, you talk about love being self-sacrificial. Is love not the giving of oneself to the other? And what happens? For the man, his seed goes out. The Greek word for seed, by the way, is spermati, commonly translated into English as sperm. His seed goes out from him, his power goes out from him. And that is the beginning of his death, in a way, because now he will become a father, death to self. His life will be oriented towards sacrifice for his wife and children, and he will give rise to new life, the future. And his job, spiritually, is to direct them to God, to glorify God with their life, with everything they do. When you rob a man of that, you create a distortion in his soul that becomes perverse. And then you get these really twisted power structures like we see in Rome. And then you put on layers of self-deception. And then, of course, these ancillary things which tend to happen, like you'll see these men who were really never interested in women to begin with, but they figure if I go into this Catholic seminary, I can kill two birds with one stone. Mom will think I'm holy, I'll look holy, and nobody will question why I'm not married. And that's where you get, some of these statistics I hear. I don't know how accurate they are. 70, 80% of the seminaries, they're gay, frankly. Now you've got these gay men who are never interested in a woman, and they're going to be a presbyteros, a presbyter in a parish, which consists almost entirely of married families, right? Especially in the Catholic Church, where they're having, they make the Mormons blush. They're having so many kids. And you've got a gay pastor who never was even vaguely interested in a woman. He's going to give them advice on marriage and family life, which should be holy. What a mess.
Sub question, or just a slight little tangent. What is the Orthodox teaching or stance on contraception?
Well, generally speaking, the teachings of the Orthodox Church are not codified into law. So we have canon law, to be sure. But the very understanding of canon law, and in Greek canon means kanona, which means like a measuring stick. It was always understood as, and this is really important, Benjamin, canon law was to bring the sinner back to the life of the church, to the life in Christ. It was never to penalize. In the Catholic Church, it became codified, like laws, and it became about punishment. So, of course, the Catholic Church codifies this, right? The issue of contraception. The Orthodox Church is far less clear on it. And that's important because some very prominent Orthodox commentators have come out and basically suggested the Catholic position, which is not accurate. And many of those prominent Orthodox clergy we see in social media are themselves converts, and though they wear a cassock that looks Orthodox and they have gigantic pectoral crosses and long beards, they actually are having a hard time parting with their former mindset. In Greek we say phronima. It's not really an Orthodox phronima. The reality is the church in her economia, we say, in her understanding, her flexibility. So we get the word economics in English. In her economia, sees the spirit of the law as directing the faithful. So the idea that a husband and a wife would find in this loving communion the extinguishing of the passions, the carnal passions, we'll use a Catholic word, the carnal passions. The church recognizes that communion, that mystery of giving one to oneself, has value, even though its intention, it's the reason for it is the creation of new life. That in itself has value. So the teachings of the Orthodox Church would say that, of course, the path of marriage is to create children. There is really no need for contraception, chemical or otherwise. But I think the church, in her economia, and her pastoral love for the married family, also recognizes human frailty. And that's the beauty of Orthodoxy. That's the profundity of Orthodoxy. And when you look at the Catholic faith, they're angry. You talk to these Catholics, they're disenfranchised and they're so angry. Every single time, it's because they feel there's an abuse of power and authority. Every single time. They just feel, this animosity. It's vitriolic. You don't encounter that with the Orthodox. You really don't. They may not like the priest. They may not like the bishop. I've said this before. But I have yet, at least me, my personal experience, I have yet to find someone who says, I really am angry at the Orthodox Church. So if you were really to speak to a married family and to listen to their life and what it's about and their struggles, would you want to be laying down the law for them? They're already involved in a relationship involved in self-sacrifice and trying to raise up children. Not an easy task. You know that. You're a father. And now the church is going to enter into the bedroom and start laying down more laws? I don't know. I would say to the Catholics, go very slow. Be very understanding of the married family. And the church, I think the church has done a very good job with that.
A lot of what is or has been happening in my culture, speaking just Western culture, but in America and in our politics, descending for centuries. It's a big thing happened about 500 years ago where a man broke with the Catholic Church. Martin Luther was his name. And since that moment, and facilitated by the technologies such as the printing press and economics and mercantilism and so on and so forth, the history of my civilization has been defined by authority and anti-authority, by authority and liberty. And what we're facing right now, in the shadow of World War II, where technology and authority reached a terrific level of ingenuity and evil, just pure evil. What we're facing now is this thing called liberalism, which seems to define itself as being against authority. And I'm sorry, I'm going on at length, but what happened is that from the Catholic Church splintered all these different versions of Christianity that were defined in opposition to the Catholic Church. And I think it was defined in opposition to authority, or to the way in which Catholicism codified authority. And I think to this day, the resonances of that break are evident everywhere and are resolving now into hyper-individualism, because nobody has authority over anyone else other than just don't yuck somebody else's yum is probably the most pathetic version of this morality. And that's where we go right now. So I'm wondering, from a outsider's view, and I bring up the word outsider because you described how converts to Orthodoxy still have a framework that carries over from Catholicism or from this other kind of Western tradition. I'm wondering what you see.
Catholicism, but yeah. Actually, think it's converts, but yeah.
What is the formulation of authority that we got wrong? And how can, from the Orthodox perspective, how can we reconstitute what is proper authority, proper obedience, to kind of get our lives back on track, to get our civilization back on track?
There's a lot of questions in there, Ben.
Yeah, I do that sometimes.
You're right. Martin Luther came along, and then was it Johannes Gutenberg who invented the printing press, printed the Bible? And then all of a sudden everyone had access to the Word of God. It wasn't merely from the priest preaching on Sunday, or from the diakos, the deacon, reading from the Amvon in the church. They would go up these spirals and they would read. Yeah. If you talk, at least the Protestants I know, I have some very good friends who are Protestants. I love them very much, but everything's an argument. It's like the articular activity that they default to. Like, no matter what you say, it's going to be an argument. So is that freedom? That looks like paralysis to me. Mentioned authority and anti-authority. I think it might more aptly be described as abuse of authority and anti-abuse of authority. Martin Luther had a beef to pick for a reason, because of indulgences. It was a total perversion of the mysteria of the church, the sacraments of the church. right? It was bastardizing Holy Confession. And it was turning the church into a den of thieves. And understandably, he was bothered by that. He didn't want to create a schism, as it were. But if that becomes your whole mindset, you can never have ησυχία, right? Like we talked about earlier, you can never have quiet. If everything's a fight, freedom is paradoxical. Greek, the word paradox is paradoxos, means standing aside glory. So doxa is glory and paradoxos, it's paradoxical. Because the first thing God does, Benjamin, you see, is he imbued his creation with freedom. And the reason for that is because you couldn't have love without first having freedom. The prerequisite to love is freedom and humility. You cannot have someone who's not free and say there's truly a divine love, that there is because like in Greek, there's this beautiful word, theoerota. Like, that's combining the words theo, God, and erotas, like erotic, like almost like an erotic God, like an ecstasis, like an ecstasy. A love that's so great that you're standing beside yourself. Imagine that for a moment. That's a free act. You cannot force that on somebody. You cannot impress it upon them. You cannot coerce it out of them. But for those who cannot lead, like we spoke about earlier, obedience becomes through fear. Authority through fear, right? So it's not really authority that we should be declaiming against. It's the abuse of authority. The real man who becomes fully man does so by fully knowing and loving God. And when he does that, he cannot abuse his authority, because his authority comes from God. And those around him who have eyes to see and ears to hear recognize it. There's really no dispute. There's nothing to argue over. You might think you hear, I always use this analogy, you might think you hear a lion roar one night. Like, you've got this beautiful cat. By the way, your backyard reminds me of a monastery. There's cats everywhere in the monasteries.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, that was a lion. But it might have just been your cat. But you hear a lion roar? I mean, you know damn well that's a lion. You only have to see it done right once, Benjamin. You say, oh, that's how it's done. I get it now.
Yeah.
Leaves a mark, an indelible mark on your mind. And then you realize all this other BS Protestants are fighting about, and there's 1,600 different denominations they've created. What a tragedy. What did they gain? They lost the sacraments. They lost the idea of priesthood. They mock the priesthood, most of these denominations now, in my opinion, the way they manifest it. It's the furthest thing from advice. They blurred the lines on God's magnificent diversity, starting with gender, and ironically call it diversity. It's like an insane asylum. The devil must be eating it up. He loves it. Confuses seekers, confuses those young men and women who are looking for answers so desperately, especially in our day and age.
What do you think is calling young people right now to Orthodoxy, especially? There's just been it's getting really popular right now, and it might be just a new girl on the dance floor kind of phenomena. But what do you think is calling them, and what do you think Orthodoxy has for these young people?
Well, I think Orthodoxy was always popular personally. Maybe I'm biased, but I always thought it was the most beautiful manifestation of the church that Christ established on earth, the most full. I always thought it was the romance of the Christian faith. It leaves you for want of nothing. And interestingly, of course, Orthodoxy was stifled under Ottoman rule for so long. And then in many Orthodox communities, it was stifled under communism. So the West simply didn't have access. What did they have? They had access to the Catholic Church, which, in my opinion, is not a very humble church. The claims they make are not humble, period. From the top to the bottom. But then, as communism fell, after Ottoman rule fell and so forth, people started to rediscover Orthodoxy, but very often it was cloaked behind national languages and cultures and so forth. And that's very normal. In the Catholic Church, even, there was an Italian Catholic community at one point. There was an Irish Catholic community. That's normal. Now I think people in the West are waking up to this church, which is so unadulterated. These Catholics they're kind of confused. They're not really very well educated, because Catholics are brought up in the catechism, ironically using a Greek word, right? The Catholic catechism. The Catholic word Catholic, of course, is Greek, katholikos. they're brought up with blinders on deliberately. So you can have really, really smart Catholic people, geniuses even. They have 2 PhDs, and they don't know the first thing about Orthodoxy. Now, that's not by chance. They'll see, newsreels online of Ukraine or Russia, or I don't know, they might even visit an Orthodox country like Greece, and they see all these white churches with blue domes, and they never actually ask the question, what is this? Because they've been indoctrinated, let's say, to believe that the Catholic Church is the only thing, there's the one true church. And that's really unfortunate. And I think that it's time to pay the piper, because the Catholics are so disenfranchised. I mean, their participation in Mass is falling off a cliff. You hear a lot of these, again, these prominent Catholic commentators coming out and making all these assertive statements. And they're really kind of like closet Orthodox, right? Like you see like Mel Gibson, and I don't want to talk about the second tier, I don't want to say any names, and I have nothing against Mel Gibson, he's a great guy. But they're always talking about the traditional Catholic Mass, they want to go back to tradition this, and pre-Vatican I, and pre-Vatican II. Like, well, why don't you just keep going back and you'll discover Orthodoxy? How about that?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
So, and what would you lose? You would gain everything, actually. Like, you don't, like, from the time, especially from the time of Thomas Aquinas on, like, the Catholic Church did not gain anything by trying to integrate Aristotle into the teachings of the Church. There's nothing that their modern saints, and I don't mean to speak ill of the Western Latin modern saints, but I have yet to hear anything any of them have said which is in any way close to what the fathers of the Church have said in the East. It's something less every time. Again, I'm not criticizing them, but there should be a modicum of humility that you're not saying anything new. Why are you going through this cycle now where you have to go and recapture your origins? You see Pope Leo come out in his first homily after the Mass. He, to his credit actually, points out the very serious problem with the primacy of the bishop in Rome and the problems that's caused. So what do I think? Why do I think all these young people? Because they realize, like, you go through anywhere in the Northeast or the Northwest in America or Canada, and they've turned the Catholic churches into apartment buildings or gymnasiums, whatever they do. It looks a lot like communism, actually, because they would do that in communist countries. So they've desecrated these sacred places. And even in countries where that's not allowed, like where I live in Switzerland, they have these beautiful Catholic churches, and they're like museums because nobody uses them. And so, like, the Catholic government, for example, the Swiss government is starting to figure it out because they're getting inundated with Muslims, immigrants. And they don't want them to build mosques because they realize they'll lose their cultural identity, like the UK and Ireland and France, which are almost like caliphates. I mean, they're heading in that direction. So what do? They tell the Serbians and the Romanians, well, you can use these churches to have the holy services there. So you see, like, Orthodoxy even taking over Catholicism. Now, the average American in America probably cannot articulate that phenomena very well, but you see it very real in a country like Switzerland. But they know that something is wrong with a mandate on clergy celibacy. They have an instinct, because St. Paul tells us that the law is written on our hearts, that family is holy. And they know that there's been an attack on the family decades in the making from Madison Avenue, one of the favorite venues of the slanderer, the devil. In Greek, the diabolos, the devil, means the slanderer, the one who tells lies. So they know they're surrounded by this matrix of lies. They may not be able to articulate it exactly in those terms, but their heart is leading them to the mystery that is preserved in the Orthodox Church, the mystery of God's love. And when they encounter that, they know that they want more. That's what they're seeing. So the jig is up, I think, for the Latin Church, if it were. I mean, forgive me for sounding judgmental, and I was educated by Catholics. I have a debt of gratitude to them. I think they've contributed tremendously good things to the world. But the jig is up on all the ecclesiological problems and the false teachings and the abuse of power. And if you have any doubt about where that misguided ecclesiology can go, it can go as far as harming children, as we see in the clergy sex abuse scandals, which are not just a phenomenon of 20 years ago or 25 years ago. We see even recent cases now where this has been going on for a very long time. And if that's not the work of the devil, I'm not sure what is. So something is wrong.
What was the primary misstep that led the Catholic Church in this direction and preserved the Orthodox Church? Historical contingencies and, the fate of empires aside, like what was the step?
The understanding of power and authority. The idea that the bishop in Rome was the successor to Peter, and that the interpretation of Christ's words, that upon this rock I'll build my church. And when the bishop of Rome took it upon himself to break from the other bishops in that synodal system, then that was the beginning of an abuse of power. And it went down a rabbit hole. And then you have all these other synods and so forth, and there's synod and synodality.
And then the fracturing of Catholicism into Protestantism.
You got a statue of Pachamama and St. Peter's, and that's where it leads. You know, it leads to horrible things.
Okay. So it was the centralization of, well, spiritual power and terrestrial power together.
You know, I'm not sure it's even real power anymore at that point.
Well,
to the extent it stops reflecting the life of Christ, a life in Christ, what is that? That's just human power. That's not from God. If it was from God, it wouldn't lead to all these abuses. Look, you've got a whole church full of men in the Catholic Church who don't know how to be men. I don't want to cast a broad net, but there's a masculinity problem in the Catholic Church. I'm just going to say it. I'm going to say the quiet part out loud. Now, their women deny it vociferously. You got all these prominent Catholic commentators like Lila Rose and Candace Owens, and how great their marriage is. And you're like, and then you see the marriage because they bring you in the public spotlight. You're like, wait, there's a little bit of like gender role confusion going on here. Like, you know, like the Orthodox, we don't really have those issues, you know? And I think the young people, apparently, especially young men, they get it. They're like, wait, this is like decades, centuries in the making. And so, but getting back to the issue of synodality, which I'm sure you know the story, I don't want to repeat it or bore you with it, but the beauty of Orthodoxy really is that it's not only that you could have a bishop in who's corrected by his brother bishops, but it's the integration of the laity as well. They play such an incredible role, and the system works really, really well to this day. I'm here to tell you. The harmony between the faithful, we can say the body of Christ, and the head of Christ, the presbyter who stands in the place of the bishop, it just creates so many layers of safeguard and so many layers of creating the true communion of the people, the body of Christ, into one. And I hate to sound judgmental, but I feel it's important to speak the truth that when you encounter the Catholic communities, it's absent in my experience. I haven't seen it. I see this idea of the superiority, even of the priest in the parish, this clerical superiority, this mindset that is so off-putting to the family, to the young, to the seeker.
Yeah, it was a few years ago, I had to, for some reason, I woke up early on a Sunday and I'm like, I got to go to church. And I drove my little car down to church. I'm just going to do a Catholic church because I know it's going to be contained. And, or I know it's going to be predictable. I know it's not going to interfere with what I need. I'm thirsting for something. And I went there and I received a message very strongly about my life and where I needed to go next. And it was really powerful. It happened in the context of the Catholic Church. So I'm like, oh, maybe I should like go to more services. And I started shopping around and I went to one in downtown Olympia, Washington. And this is going to sound sexist for me, but that's fine. I'm used to that categorization of my beliefs. But they had women up there carrying things around and doing things. I'm like, it's just the wrong articulation. And there was way too many people there. And I couldn't worship because there was just children running around, which is a whole other issue we don't need to get into. But it was just so many layers of interruption between me and trying to be in a receptive state for the Holy Spirit, as I think of it. So it was interesting. Like there was confusion in the power structure, even at that level, and it came down to like where the women were placed in the service. And I don't know if that's sexist or not, but that's a particularly modern frame of view.
Well, I think it's so simple, actually, Benjamin. Like when you go into an Orthodox church, to the right of the Aurea Pili, which is the beautiful gates that go into the sanctuary. So there's three parts to the church, right? There's the narthex. Outside the narthex, I like to say the exonarthex, the narthex, the solea, where the faithful sit, and then there's the sanctuary, where the priest goes and the deacon. To the right of the sanctuary, you always see the icon of Christ. To the left, you see the icon of the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary. To the right of Christ, you see John the Baptist. To the left of the Theotokos, you see the patron saint of the church. For example, if the church is St. Catherine, you'll see St. Catherine. If it's St. George, you'll see St. George. And you see the archangels on the left and the right side. archangels Michael and Gabriel. In the Orthodox countries, traditionally, the men sit on the right side of the church, in front of the icon of Christ, and the women on the left. The idea that the man should reflect the image and likeness of Christ, and that the woman should reflect the image and likeness of the Theotokos, in my mind, is not revolutionary. But simple as it is, we've managed to confuse it in modern society. So imagine that. The church has her teachings right there, and the layout and the structure of the church. And the Orthodox Church, of course, maintains the iconostasis, so the icon screen that separates the sanctuary from the solea. Historically, the catechoumeni, the catechumens, would stand in the narthex. They were not permitted to the solea. There was a structure to everything. And it was designed to teach. Ήταν didaktikos, we say in Greek. It was instructive. And I think you have this word in English, didactic. Everything you did taught. But now, because we're all have this Protestant mindset, we're all super hyper individualistic, everyone's opinion is equal, right? Nobody can teach me anything because I already know everything. Not so when you enter the Orthodox Church. So when you put vestments on a woman, or you mix it up, and she's going in and out of the altar, we say, well, okay, a woman, of course, is creating the image and likeness of God. She has this amazing ability that a man can never have to give birth to a child. She, it's so incredible. But do we need to confuse the images? I mean, at the end of the day, Christ was a man. And frankly, I don't like the idea of seeing a woman crucified. Call me old-fashioned. When I hear about women fighting on the front lines and doing the Air Force, I go, okay, that's nice. To me, I think women are beautiful. I think they're feminine. I think that's wonderful. I don't like the idea of them being in harm's way. I don't particularly like the idea of a woman having to work. Maybe she'd like to work. That's great. They can make great CEOs, business, whatever. Women are brilliant in everything they do. But I don't like the idea of a woman having to sacrifice for the family. I like the idea of a man having to do that. So why convolute the images? It's there, and as I say, simple as it is, we've managed to convolute it. I should say these elements in society that desire the destruction of the family have managed to do that. And it's been quite effective. It's really done a job on the family. See all these divorce families. The new things, people don't even want to get married. It was a crisis that people wanted to get divorced. Now they don't even want to get married.
Yeah. Well, we kind of broken even the concept of marriage, but that's another hot topic.
Oh, yeah. People don't even know what it is, for sure.
Yeah.
No concept.
Yeah. I appreciate...
Certainly not a sacramental understanding of it.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the service that you were giving to the conjugal act as a spiritual act, an act of worship. I think that's if that's not in the center of our conception of what sex is, then everything else is just... You end up where we are now, which is just people treating it like just another bodily function, like passing gas, right? There's no necessarily, well, there's probably a higher meaning to passing gas. Who knows? I don't know what the church's teachings of that are, but it's certainly a different function. Can I ask you a little speculative question? I was speaking with a autodidactic Orthodox convert a couple weeks ago, brilliant young man, but he's not a priest. And we were talking about Orthodoxy and how Orthodoxy would, in its evangelical function, would meet the culture where it was. And you can see a lot of historical, there's the Greek Orthodox, there's the Russian Orthodox, Serbian, Bulgarian, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a cultural incrustation in that forms the carapace of the church to certain degrees. If America becomes more and more Orthodox, how would that work out? Like if Orthodoxy comes to America, like what is Orthodoxy going to take of America? How is it going to adapt itself to these Protestant modern people?
Well, the church should not adapt itself to the local culture. The culture has to adapt itself to the church. So eventually there will be an indigenous Orthodox church. The OCA would like to stake claim to that now, but they're not really indigenous. If they were, they wouldn't be wearing Russian regalia, which nobody can explain to me how that works. They can't make it make sense. And it's a little weird because you'll see and they got some amazing priests, let me tell you. Some of the priests I admire the most are in Royal Corps and OCA and so forth. But you see these priests and they're totally American. They don't speak a lick of Russian. They've never been to Russia. And it's kind of like nostalgic in their mind, is like this holy land. And they wear these kalimafi, we say in Greek. They've got like this the velvet purple hats. You would only see in Russia. To me, I'm just thinking it's a little strange. Eventually, we need a truly indigenous American Orthodox Church, but that has to happen very slowly because Orthodoxy is something that really takes time to develop that mindset. And the mind of the Church in America is very young; it's very immature, and we need, frankly, monasticism in America, which we have. There's in dozens of monasteries. It takes time. America itself is a young country, so and especially a society in a country that has been so damaged by unruly capitalism, the replacement of a person's identity with all the wrong things. In other words, their identity is not in relation to God, the other. Like, Martin Buber has this great book, Ich und Du in German, it's I and Thou. This idea that I am in relationship to my God. It hardly exists in the collective consciousness of Americans anymore. So Orthodoxy will need time. There's this huge influx, glory be to God. But we need to act as presbyters. We need to act with humility in the reception of these converts and with special sensitivity to their needs. I just spoke with a young man just last night who reached out to me he was in California. Wonderful young man, and he'd contacted me over social media. And I said, well, when did you enter into the Orthodox Church? He said, well, just this last Easter. I said, oh, wow, that's really early on. And he had all these big questions. I said, well, just give us some time. It's really early in your journey. Even if you were doing something completely outside the church, outside of ecclesiological circles, there's a saying, it takes like 10,000 hours to get good at anything, right? I mean, if you were going to become a wood carver, you would give yourself years, right? Whatever the task is. To understand the mind of the Orthodox Church, particularly its mysticism, right? Its idea of God as apophasis, as apophatic, as mystery, as everything I'm not. I mean, wrap your mind around that for a second, right? Like everything I'm not is what God is, right? And since I cannot conceive of what I'm not, and this is an interesting topic for the age of AI we're living in now, right? Where people really believe this could be God. Talk about the ultimate lie. That takes some time because when you're brought up, you talked about habits earlier, you used that word. Habits take time to form. And while we often discuss how difficult it is to part with bad habits, good habits are also hard to part with. So frequent participation in the life of the church and the holy services, receiving the mysteries of the church, holy unction, confession, holy communion especially, understanding marriage, as you pointed out accurately, Benjamin, that marriage is a sacramental issue. If you don't understand it in terms of sacrament, it's going to struggle. You're going to
It's
really
just
have
a
a hard
contract.
time.
It's just a business contract. You're a partner,
Exactly.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And that word partner is used ubiquitously nowadays.
Yeah.
So, that it's not easy to change one's mindset. It takes time, right? So one has to be patient and humble. There is a fervor that comes with conversion. And I think that's a special grace by God, that when you first enter into the life of Christ, God gives you this extraordinary energy. And that's for a reason, because you're going to need it. But later on, as you grow, it's not all going to be easy. It's going to be a struggle. Like everything else good in life, everything has a price. And trying to live in this theosis, this divinization, right? We talk about Christ becoming man. And as you know, of course, Christ did that so that man might become like God. It's simple, but not easy. It's not complex. It involves self-sacrifice, which is counterintuitive, not just to the American Western mindset, but to the mindset of the flesh, which is very strong, which desires other things. It doesn't desire infinite joy, which can be let into your heart. It desires the temporal and fleeting pleasures of the flesh, right? You talked about, the insertion of human sexuality in a very profane way. And we look at Hollywood, for example. Thank God Hollywood's in decline. They insert immorality into everything. Why? So that the young mind or the young person, their eyes are distracted from where they should be looking.
Yeah.
And find this magnificent beauty and blessing that the Lord gave us, and we're distracted with. It's like a kid who's never been to the beach, right, in the summer, and instead he's playing in the mud with a bunch of broken toys. You're like, wait, but you could go to the beach and be in the coast, and they see beautiful, but they don't even know it exists. So they think that they found, their purpose, which is, again, temporal pleasures. The whole society is geared towards that. Instant gratification. And it's keeping us from knowing something of the numinous, from the other, the mystery of God's love, which we find, like we said in the beginning, in the silence, in the ησυχία.
Is there a C.S. Lewis of Orthodoxy?
There are many. St. Gregory the Theologian, St. John Chrysostom, you just go down the list. I mean, you read them and you say, well, C.S. Lewis is great, I love him, but just read those guys. You really want to be blown away.
Is there, yeah, so there is a rich writing tradition, a rich tradition of, I guess, not argument, but apologetics. What would it be called?
Well, not all saints are apologists. Some are simply martyrs. You know, in Greek, the word martyr, martyria, just means witness. So they witnessed their faith. So we see the martyrs, the ones who were killed, they bore witness for their faith. They're persecuted. Others are teachers. Others are the prophets.
And what does your work online look like? I guess offline too. Like, what is your role in the world, and online and off?
Well, I'm a priest, obviously. I have been since 2011, but even prior to that, my entire adult life, I served the church as a layman as well. I'm a husband and a father. I built a church. I reestablished communities where there was no priest, including in Switzerland. I've tried to serve God the best way I know how. Maybe I've failed in some ways, maybe not. And I think my legacy will be written probably after I'm gone. More recently, we started a podcast. My presbytera is just, the wife of a priest. It's the feminine of presbyter. And that has been an interesting journey. I think it's a very valid and good way to evangelize, is to use technology. Technology is not inherently bad, just should be used for the right purpose. One good way to use technology is to use it to teach, like you're doing, Benjamin, by bringing out conversations and exposing it to many people. So we have other things that have been involved in teaching in the areas of economics and capital markets and so forth as well. And a prior life as an entrepreneur.
Oh, really? Starting a church is probably very similar to starting a business, if not identical, except for the spiritual aspect of it.
I would say it's almost nothing in common.
Okay. No.
If you try to build a church, especially in a very anti-Christian or secular environment, as I did, it wasn't even really me, right? It was by the grace of God, through the intercession of the Holy Spirit, Theotokos, and St. Catherine, the patron saint of that church. I always tell people, I didn't build a church, and it didn't come to be because of me. It came to exist despite me. Despite me. But when you do something like building a church, first, there's tremendous risk of pride, spiritual pride, which has deleterious effects on your soul. And the second thing is, the devil doesn't like it. Now, if you go someplace where there's a ton of churches, no big deal. You go someplace that's highly secular or even pagan, like where I did it in Vermont, which is the most secular state in America. It's a very dark place spiritually. They have death tourism and they love drugs and all these things. It's just sorcery. And you're like, yeah, I'll just build a church here. And the devil has other ideas. And all sorts of obstacles spring up to stop you, to stifle you, to slow you down. And ideally, to cause you to fail, if possible. But as has been said, if God is with you, who can be against you? So long as you do it with humility, prayer, the blessings of a hierarch, then every time God prevails.
Father, did I hear correctly that you have a podcast with your wife?
Yeah, it was her idea.
That's funny.
She's the brains behind the operation.
Sounds fun. What do you guys discuss? What's your general topic at this point?
Oh, it's really lighthearted. We discuss the darkest corners of government, Wall Street, and culture.
Oh, okay.
From an Orthodox Christian perspective. It's not really lighthearted, but we try to bring it back around to a hopeful tone every time.
What's it called, and where can people find it? I'll link it in the description.
It's the Father Emmanuel Lemelson podcast. You can find it on all the social media. The handle is usually at Lemelson in most cases. My last name, Lemelson. It's a very visual podcast. So it's probably best viewed on like YouTube. It's usually in 4K with headphones. There's a lot going on with subtlety in the audio, a lot of text on the screen. And it's a nascent podcast.
Yeah.
We only have about 1,000 followers on YouTube or something like that. I don't know, about 25,000 total across social media platforms. Our goal is just hopefully to contribute something positive if we can. There's some great commentators out there and a lot of people using it as a very valuable conduit to evangelize. And it's one of the wonders of our modern age that we have this resource.
Yeah.
And it's great that we can use it like you're doing so effectively, Benjamin.
It's been a fun journey for me. It's a very novel technology. It helps. I think it's reshaping, hand in hand with a lot of other factors. We're going from a culture of the written word back to a culture of the spoken word, and that comes with a lot of different parameters on how we make sense of the world, how we relate to the world. How we formulate and how we think. So podcasts are absolutely essential in this switch, or at least wise podcasts, or just media, vocal media, to insert these richer traditions and to bring to the people who are switching to this media, I guess, the good word, however you construe that.
Yeah, very, very well put, Benjamin. I agree with you entirely.
Yeah. Father Emmanuel, I will link to your work in the description. I can't remember the name of the man who hooked us up, but I'm so grateful to have interfaced with you.
His name is Cornelius, and he is wonderful.
Cornelius. Yeah.
Yeah, Cornelius, Christian. He's just a gift from God. He's been helping produce the Father Emmanuel Lemelson podcast. And we do owe him a debt of gratitude. We also really owe you a debt of gratitude, especially Benjamin, for inviting us so graciously.
No, absolutely.
It makes the work all worth it, all the learning curve and the sacrifice that goes into it to produce the show, amongst a million other things we have to do during the day. So we couldn't do it without people like you who give us a chance to be heard and to extend our reach.
Well, I hope that my audience checks your work out, and thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thank you as well, Benjamin. Really enjoyed joining you today. Perhaps we'll do it again sometime.
I hope so. I'm going to end the recording. There we go. Cool.